Today, we are jumping right into a series of rook endings that can be pretty complicated and difficult to understand, I think, even for advanced players. I won't do much review about what the first two videos covered. And if you want to know about some of the basic rook ending positions, starting with the Lucina and bridge position onto the Philidor drawing methods, as well as king on short side, rook on long side, please check out those videos. So today, we are looking at a frontal attack position here. This position is one where the black king, as you'll notice, is cut off from the pawn by the rook. Now, this changes the situation vastly when you're talking about your drawing possibilities, because of the fact that if you remember the Lucina idea, the basic plan is that this king at some point will try to wander up with the pawn one step at a time, eventually achieving a position where this rook is forced to come behind and give checks because he can't wait in front. And once that position is achieved, we know that it's a win for white because with his king in front of the pawn, we have a Lucina position. As you can tell, with the rook here cutting off the open file, we're already in a Lucina position. What this means is that when you're dealing with a frontal attack position and your king is already cut off from the pawn, unless you know the technical drawing idea, very difficult to figure out over the board for the first time. So let's get started. We're starting with white moving forward first because it proves one of the first major points of a frontal attack, and that is that black is in sort of a semi-zugzwang here. If black could say pass, you'll notice that white would have a little bit of trouble moving forward. Can't push the pawn, and if he tries to bring the king forward, sorry, let's back up and move to show that if white were to try to move the king forward, black would come back to attack the pawn, check the king, and rinse and repeat the same process until white realizes that he can't make progress. Again, please note that bringing the rook behind the pawn would allow the king to come in front, which would lead to an easy draw as long as we understand the basic drawing methods like Philidor and those types of things. So we're not reviewing those today, but as long as you understand those basic concepts, you know that you should be able to draw if your king is able to get in front of the pawn. So let's back up again to the beginning here. Now, by moving the rook, white is asking black an important question, and that is, what's he going to do? If he moves the rook away, which we're going to get to all these possibilities. If he moves the rook away, you're obviously allowing the pawn to push. But if you move the rook up, trying to wait, now you're allowing the king to make progress, and eventually your rook isn't quite far enough to have that check that you would normally have, forcing the king to go back to protect the pawn. So bringing the rook forward is not really an option, and moving the rook away seems like the wrong idea, especially at first, because it would allow this pawn to push and continue to make this progress. So the question then comes over to the king. Well, what if we wait with the king? Well, moving the king is not a bad idea. And in fact, moving the king up would not be a bad option at all. And we're going to talk about that is one of the drawing moves here for black. But quickly, we need to discuss what happens if you try to wait with the king back. In fact, yours truly, doing this video, lost an endgame, lost a frontal attack endgame by trying this move one time, with my idea being pretty simply that I wanted to trade rooks. Now, I had calculated that if I was able to trade rooks, let's say a waiting move continued here, or let's say he tried to come up and protect the pawn first, which seems like a logical thing to do now that this king is not here to attack the rook. So by bringing the rook up to attack the pawn, he would be threatening to make progress with the king. Well, my idea there would be to offer the rook trade. And if this trade happened, with my knowledge of king and pawn endings, I would know that as long as the pawn has been advanced in front of the king, usually there's a way to maintain distant opposition by waiting. Young players would rush up here and give white the opposition, but as long as you have a good understanding of king and pawn endings, you know that a general rule is that if this pawn is in front of the king, usually you can make a waiting move, and now when he makes progress with the king, you grab the opposition and we have an easy draw here, unable to win this. So, like I said, my idea was to make a move with the king in order to offer the rook trade and go to the drawn king and pawn ending. But very important and instructive for us to point out why this loses, and that is because of this move first. The king begins to make its progress, and either way, actually, the king can come up, eventually moving away to the A file, not to allow the check on the C file. And when black goes back to attack the pawn, rather than being forced to come back and protect, we now have the opportunity to bring the rook up, something that we wouldn't be able to do if this king was still on E6, which would be able to gain a tempo on the rook and either force us to move away to protect the pawn, which gives the king space, or it would force us to give a check. And as you can see here, once the king would move back, you would still have to deal with the problem of protecting the pawn. Let's see, that got a little bit crazy there. Let's review that idea because I do feel this is an important part of understanding the ideas. And again, what we're trying to show here is that waiting with the king, trying to exchange into the king and pawn ending is generally not a good idea because the king loses the ability to attack the rook. Without the ability to attack the rook, white will make progress with the king, eventually protecting the pawn with the rook, and maybe we didn't show fully why that wins, but let's do it one more time. Now that I protected the pawn, my king will be able to continue to come forward and make progress and force black into a bad situation. So, of course, moving the king up to attack the rook doesn't quite work because I'll give check first, protect my rook, and then take yours. So let's back up again. We've reached a little bit of a conundrum. One of my favorite words from the last video, if you remember, is, again, here's the problem. Black is in a relative zugzwang here. Can't move the king backward, and by moving the rook away off the file, you allow the pawn to push, and by moving the rook on the file, you allow the king to come forward, as we mentioned at the beginning of the video. So what do we do here? This would be a moment where I would recommend the viewer to pause the video and give yourself some chance to try to solve the answer for yourself. And as normally when I teach these endgames and when I solve them myself, one of the most useful habits you can get into is trying to force yourself into over-the-board situations, as we call them, trying to force yourselves to calculate and not just be spoon-fed the information, if you will. The more you can force yourself to calculate, you'll find that it sticks with your memory much better, even though it's kind of not what you want to do sitting there and just watching the video, I understand. But if you could pause the video and try to solve the position, that would be our recommendation. Okay, we're going to assume you paused the video and now you're back after 5 minutes. So here's the answer. The most accurate way to draw after white makes this move, forcing black into this semi-zugzwang, is to bring the rook over to the long side. Kind of funny that it's the same idea as the other drawing method, king on short side, rook on long side. Not quite the same here because the king is on the same side as the rook. However, bringing the rook far away from the king and the pawn is the most accurate idea here to avoid the king's ability to attack the rook. Now, what did we say the problem with this was? Well, isn't he just going to push? And if we were simply to come back and we didn't really have any idea behind this, then that would definitely be the case. The king's going to come forward, and now you've pretty much run out of room. Any sort of waiting move you try with the rook or the king is too late because when he comes forward, you're going to run out of space to attack to attack the king and the pawn, and you're going to lose the endgame based on eventually achieving the bridge position. So our idea behind bringing this rook over here was surprisingly to get even more aggressive with the rook. Bring it up and separate the king from the pawn. Now, if this move surprises you, to move the rook away from the queening square, the protection of the queening square, then the next move will definitely surprise you. Because when white continues to move forward, the drawing idea is to recognize not to fear the pawn. You move the king, in fact, waiting even further. The idea here is pretty simple. The further the pawn pushes from the king, the easier it is going to be to win. And the problem for white is that he cannot move the rook away from the file without letting the king in. So we have a basic problem of white either has a choice to push the pawn or to move the rook off the file to try to help the pawn push. Well, logical move here is to push the pawn. The rook now comes back, and no way to stop black from coming over to win the pawn. It should be noted that as much as this check seems scary, forcing your king to the 8th rank, again, there's no progress to be made here for white. Now pushing the pawn is not even an option, and black's simple threat is to come up and attack the pawn, force it to push, or to lose the pawn. So let's review this idea here. White tries to put black in a zugzwang, again, pointing out that you can't wait on the file without allowing white to come forward and running out of space. And if you move away, seemingly you allow me to push. However, if you know the idea, which is this long side transfer of the rook to separate the king from the pawn, you will have prevented white from making the most clear progress, which is that he needs the king with the pawn. So as he continues to push, you laugh in the face of danger, move your king, and the pawn eventually strays a little bit too far from home, thus allowing you to return and win the pawn within a couple moves and reach the drawn king and pawn endgame. Okay, now the frontal attack is let's make this first move for white. So we're talking about the black side, the drawing side of the frontal attack here. The frontal attack is extremely practical, even more so than some of the basic Lucina and Philidor positions. That's partly for two reasons. One, the average, I think, 1600 and stronger player knows what those positions are. Maybe they don't always know the Lucina name or the bridge name, but if they're shown the position, generally the technique is something that they know. However, being in an endgame where you've come from a crazy position and all of a sudden you're in a situation where, your opponent's got a passed pawn and your king is not always in the optimal situation. Again, it'd be good to note that if this king was in front of the pawn, any transfer of the rook to the 6th rank, waiting on the Philidor idea, assuming we know what that is an easy draw. So whenever our king is in front of the pawn, usually those endgames lead to draws, with a few exceptions. But usually those are always a draw. So the positions that are really tough, the positions that get tough are the ones that involve your king being cut off from the pawn. Because as we know, that's basically the secret to the Lucina winning. The Lucina idea being the bridge is based on the fact that this king is cut off at least one file. And so when your king is already cut off, it makes knowing this drawing idea, the frontal attack idea, attacking it from the front, extremely important and very practical to know. So I hope that everyone takes this knowledge and immediately puts it to use. There we go. Okay, before we end this video, I'd like to show one good example. We're going to reset the position here and show one good example of the king being cut off only one file, which is what we're dealing with here. The black king is cut off one file, but that is a win. You'll notice that in video, the next video in our series here, Mastering Rook Endings, you'll notice that the king is cut off two files, which is where it gets really exciting and tricky here. And most of the time when the king is cut off more than one file, it is a loss for the defender. But quickly, we're going to set up a position where the king is only cut off one file, but is losing nonetheless. And that position is this one. This would be a moment where we would recommend a pause and take a second to try to figure out what white's move is here that wins instantly. A very important little trick to know. Okay. Rather than trying to win with any sort of progress with the king and the pawn, the most simple way to take advantage of black's awkward king position is rook to c5, instantly winning. I think a good position to show before we moved on, because typically with the king being cut off only one file, but being in an optimal situation in front of the pawn, black's rook transfer is very simple, as we saw from the last position, and the drawing ideas, once you've learned them, very straightforward. But this position, if your king is in a double jeopardy, which is not only cut off, but also a little bit behind the pawn, white has an easy way to take advantage of that. And that is by cutting the king off along the 5th rank. You'll notice that now, really, I have a hard time even recommending a move for black. Just about anything you do, this rook is going to slide over. Coming over to give checks would only help this king make progress. And black cannot prevent white from coming forward with the king, and rinse and repeat, come up with the king, push the pawn, game over. So having the king cut off one file, but also having the king behind the pawn or equal to the pawn is double jeopardy and should always be losing. Very instructive trick to remember, to cut the king off laterally and then push the pawn that way.